Our speaker today is Bart Worden, who's been our clergy leader here at the Community for Ethical Culture since 1998. He has also served as the executive director of our parent organization, AEU, since 2012. Bart, in addition to being a social worker who has worked with programs that help people recover from psychiatric disabilities. Bart's address today is entitled, "Are Our Social Media Platforms Driving Us Mad?" Welcome, Bart.
So our society is in deep distress. Rising rates of depression, anxiety, and impulse control problems are straining our social fabric and stoking fear, anger, and divisiveness. It's taking a toll on people individually and collectively. And as problems continue to mount, it can be hard to sustain hope that solutions will be found. Now, some say the problems have been greatly exacerbated by the rise of social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and hold them largely responsible. These platforms, left mostly unchecked, have greatly expanded the capabilities for angry and hostile users to spread hate, foment violence at the expense of moderation and even-handedness. But is the use of social media a significant cause of the rise of these social problems? And if so, what can be done to turn things around and mitigate some of the downsides of our technically connected age? So I'd like to start by answering my own question: are social media platforms driving us mad? I think the short answer is no. I don't see social media platforms as the cause of madness. I think it's more that people are made or mad already, actually, and the platforms amplify that madness and greatly exacerbate a common human problem. And I mean, go back to history. If you want to look at conspiracy theories, for instance, way back, there'd be a crop failure and they'd be looking for a scapegoat. Right? I mean, that is a conspiracy kind of thing where they're looking for times when people are trying to answer questions about why are things so bad. It must be somebody doing something somewhere that we can point to and blame, right? It's a common thing. By the way, the double meaning of mad is something that's intended here. So I'm looking at both, the disconnection from reality, that seems to be the case for so many points of view, as well as the incredible anger that seems to be going with a lot of this media sharing these days. In fact, I was even here today in our gathering. My prompt was to identify something that gave you cheer in social media. So I was thinking like cross-species animal greetings, kittens. I don't know, kids doing something nice for a parent, who knows what. Of course, what people really respond to are things that are probably a bit edgier than all that, right? So, but anyway, let's look at the disconnection from reality point first, right? So, QAnon is a well-known example. Kevin Roos, the New York Times article last year, wrote a December poll by NPR and Ipsos found that 17% of Americans, 17%, that's a lot more people than you'd like to know, right? 17% of Americans believed that the core falsehood of QAnon, that a group of Satan-worshiping elites who run a child sex ring are trying to control our politics and media, was true. 17%. Let's not forget Pizzagate or the InfoWars Alex Jones, currently in the news after losing yet another lawsuit for defamation in the relation to killing in 2012 of 26 people nearby in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if the settlement bankrupts InfoWars and sends a message that spreading lies will not be tolerated? Great, right? But that doesn't seem so likely, does it? And I mean, look around, at this time, there's continued claims about all kinds of bizarre stuff out there that seem to be holding their traction. And if the claims about rampant voter fraud and stolen elections are any indication, I don't think we'll be seeing a cessation of these kind of things anytime soon. So it really comes down to human nature, if you ask me, right? And so what is it about us that makes us so vulnerable to manipulation? Now, there have been psychologists studying this. So I found this report from a journal called Sage. And the person is Karen M. Douglas. And what she writes is the psychological literature on this topic has grown rapidly in the past 15 years and suggests that people are drawn to conspiracy theories when important psychological needs are not being met. Now, by the way, do people see the New York Times today? There's a whole section, opinion piece about mental health in this country. I recommend it if you get a chance to view it. It's got a lot of stuff in it. And part of what the authors there are saying is, there's a lot of things going on in our world right now that is profoundly affecting our mental health. Anyway, so in terms of there are three different areas that the researchers look to figure out what is it that makes people vulnerable to believing conspiracy stuff. So the first ones they call epistemic. And that has to do with what you know, right? And including the desire to satisfy curiosity and avoid uncertainty. Right? So oftentimes when people are in a position where they just don't quite understand something, they may very well start looking for some kind of answers. And all too often, the answers that seem reasonable to some people are a little bit strange. All right. And research has linked conspiracy beliefs with the search for patterns and meaning, even when no such patterns exist. People just trying to figure things out. So the second set of needs are existential, right? Including the desire to restore a threatened sense of security or control. Does this one sound familiar? So for instance, people are more likely to believe conspiracy theories when they are anxious or worried, and when they feel that they have no power. Or, for instance, if they've lost an election. The third set of needs are social, right? Including the desire to hold one's self and one's groups in positive regard. For instance, people are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. Ooh, oh, what happened here? Oh, sorry. Touchscreens are great. However, if you touch the wrong part of the screen, it makes it a little more. This is the social needs, including the desire to hold oneself and one's groups in positive regard. So people are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories if they need to feel unique compared to others, feel a need to belong, or feel that their group is underappreciated or under threat. Again, familiar, right? We have these things deeply embedded in our beings, right? These are needs that everybody has. And what's happening now is these needs are being expressed in ways that often are unexpected. And unexpected needs seem to be kind of getting a lot more traction than expected ones. So part of that has to do with how our social media systems are set up. You may recall that Facebook initially started as an effort for people to compare pictures of undergrads at Harvard and rate them hot or not. Does this sound familiar? And so from the get-go, these platforms were designed to get people to look, to respond, and to vote. Right. And so this is kind of built into the basic understanding here. And that has continued. There's a book out fairly recently, The Chaos Machine by Max Fisher. And the New Yorker reviewed it. And this is one of the things they said in there. The enjoyment of moral outrage is one of the key sentiments Fisher sees being exploited by algorithms devised by Google for YouTube and Meta for Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, which discovered they could monetize this impulse, right? So again, the impulse is moral outrage. They discovered they could monetize this impulse by having their algorithms promote hyper-partisanship. Divisiveness drives engagement, which in turn drives advertising revenues. Fisher details the evolution of behavioral technologies that belie the many denials by company representatives that their platforms are inherently or intentionally manipulative. Now, Jonathan Haidt had an interesting interview at NPR that I got to listen to, and he has some kind of a little bit different takes on the situation. One of the things he notes is that prime drivers of social media is actually a pretty small group of radical people, radical white left and radical white right men. Rich, wealthy men on the right and the left are a small percentage of people who are really driving a lot of the hate and anger and everything else going on in our system. And it's really unfortunate. The thing is, Haidt notices that the people who actually design these systems very often are people who are politically progressive, right? And that what they're really thinking is that really what we want to see is opening things up. So there's this democratic capacity for everyone to participate, for everyone to have as much power as everyone else and all those kind of things, right? So they open these platforms up. And Haidt says, you know, a really conservative person would never have gone in that direction. They wouldn't like this idea of things being so open. They're just worried about things losing control. Yeah. So the great irony here is, you know, who are the folks that are really benefiting the most from this loss of control are people who probably would never have accepted that going into this. So we have a really difficult situation there. But the thing is, the way the system is built, those people who are loud and obnoxious are going to be heard and seen more deeply. And when moderate people see these things coming up as responses to them, it tends to shut them down. So you have this seesaw happening here where people kind of say these really mean, nasty, terrible things, and that gets people's attention. And so other people jump in and start doing this as well. Meanwhile, the folks who are a little bit more even tempered and less likely to go off on these sorts of things get quieter and quieter and quieter, right? How many people, by the way, are still on Facebook in this room? Oh, okay, more than I would have thought. I put my hand up, but I'm really not anymore. I haven't posted to Facebook. I tried to post on Friday night, I guess, and it didn't go well. So, but I don't look at Facebook. I don't post to Facebook because I feel just so annoyed about this situation going on. Now, maybe that's the wrong thing to do, but that's what I've worked for. So Haidt maintains in his article that, so the article, by the way, that the interview was about was why the past 10 years of American life have been uniquely stupid. And it's an article in The Atlantic, which you can certainly enjoy reading, I'm sure. And he indicates that the move to add like, retweet, and quote tweet functions have energized angry and divisive trolls while silencing the more moderate users. And this is his quote. This new game encouraged dishonesty and mob dynamics. Users were guided not just by their true preferences, but by their past experiences of reward and punishment, and their prediction of how others would react to each new situation. One of the engineers at Twitter who had worked on the retweet button later revealed that he regretted his contribution because it had made Twitter a nastier place. As he watched Twitter mobs forming through the use of the new tool, he thought to himself, we might have just handed a 4-year-old a loaded weapon. So Haidt points to 3 areas to address as a way to kind of quell some of these problems. And I think they actually are pretty needed, pretty interesting, and maybe helpful. We'll see. So you can tell me what you think. He thinks that you need to redesign democracy for the digital age. But to do so is going to take a lot of work, and he says a lot more than a social psychologist can offer. But he has three goals that he thinks would be helpful to pursue: to harden the democratic institutions so they can withstand chronic anger and mistrust, reform social media so that it becomes less socially corrosive, and better prepare the next generation for democratic citizenship in this new age. And he has recommendations for each of these that I'll share with you. Now, one thing to note is he is not somebody who is calling for content restriction. One of the things that he says is, first of all, it doesn't work. You know, the stuff comes in so much more quickly than they could ever do anything about. And you wind up having all kinds of difficulties trying to sort out what belongs and what doesn't. So he's looking to do something on the other end of it. How do you kind of mitigate the sharing of content that is objectionable? How do you help slow that down? And hopefully enhance other kinds of sharing that would be, more beneficial. He and a lot of us talked about kind of the early days of Facebook. Do you remember this? The first time you got a Facebook account and like people from your high school class found you, or somebody else from some summer camp someplace, or who knows where, now found you when you got a chance to kind of connect with somebody you hadn't heard from a long time, or you got to see what somebody else was eating and it looked pretty nice. I mean, there are all these kind of nice, fun, enjoyable things, but where is that gone? But does it have to be gone? Can't we find a way to kind of enjoy our time digitally again? Is a good question. Anyway, so when it comes down to hardening democratic institutions, he recommends, this is a quote from Jonathan Haidt, reform should reduce the outsized influence of angry extremists and make legislators more responsible to the average voter in their district. Let's remember, we have a lot of things happening on the Supreme Court, for instance, which are going against public opinion. Right? So one example of such a reform is to end closed party primaries, replacing them with a single nonpartisan open primary from which the top several candidates advance to a general election that also uses ranked choice voting. This is something that's actually happening already, I believe, in Alaska. And didn't Sarah Palin just miss getting reelected? One of the tactics that's been employed against people that voted for impeachment or didn't indicate that the January 6th incursion was an effort to do a coup, are getting punished by having other people run against them in primaries so that they can't get reelected, right? Having this open so that the primary is just everybody who could be popular could really reduce some of that kind of behavior. A widely discussed reform would end this political gamesmanship by having justices serve staggered 18-year terms so that each president makes one appointment every 2 years. Here. Would have had a different makeup for sure if that was in place. Right? So let's look about reforming social media. Facebook whistleblower Frances Hogan advocates for simple changes to the architecture of the platforms rather than massive and ultimately futile efforts to police all content. For example, she has suggested modifying the share function on Facebook so that after any content has been shared twice, the third person in the chain must take the time to copy and paste the content into a new post. It's remarkable how lazy people truly are, all right? And the easier you make it to just forward things, the worse you're making it for people that are really, really interested and really want to do something. So just that simple thing of making the third person copy and paste really does restrict things. And I believe that's something that is going to be in place in a number of countries in Europe going forward. And it'd be nice to have it here too. Perhaps the biggest single change, this is continuing with Haidt, perhaps the biggest single change that would reduce the toxicity of existing platforms would be user verification as a precondition for gaining the algorithm amplification that social media offers. Right. So in layman's terms, that means if you want to like or share or retweet, you have to first demonstrate that you're not a robot and that you are actually an actual person. When you go to the bank, for instance, who does online banking? I mean, it's fun. I highly recommend it, by the way. It really works great. Anyway, when you try to set up your bank account, you have to prove who you are, right? But it's not like every time you talk to anyone that they have to know that. But if the system is set up so that only those people who will authenticate themselves can go ahead and do the retweets and other things along those lines, that's really cutting in to a lot of activity, right? Because it's the anonymity that is so dangerous. The sense that people have that nothing will ever come back to them because who can know who they are. It also is likely to make it harder for bots, robots basically, to be doing a lot of stuff. I think the robots may have been kind of an overblown concern, but it's still a concern. It's something that I think would be good to address. Anyway, Ike's notion is if you make it so that people have to verify themselves on each of these platforms before doing these kind of things, you would really cut in to a lot of this behavior. And another important change is to reduce the damaging effects of social media on children. And the way to do that is to delay entry until they have passed through puberty. Why are we letting 13-year-olds do this stuff? I mean, do we really want to hear them on a lot of these matters? Maybe, but I think because it's such a caustic environment, it's hard to imagine that it's not damaging people. And if you look at the rates of mental health issues that have been skyrocketing, especially among teens and preteens, it's scary, right? The level of depression and anxiety and stress. Hyde actually had a controversial thing about how the coddling of the American mind. I don't know if people saw that book. It got a lot of bad press from progressives for sure. But part of his point was that we have done too little to allow people to get involved in the cut and thrust of real human relationships. By restricting who can come on a college campus and getting also worried about people getting triggered by things along those lines. So there's a real downside to that. And that downside is that people lose the confidence that they have resilience themselves. But one of the things that he talks about is, how terrible it is that people are spending so much time with their phones in ways that they don't really like and is having a bad impact on them, but they can't seem to stop it. And of course, he's giving these lectures and people are on their phones the whole time. But when he's talked to people after the lectures, he says they routinely agree with this, right? That they really find it hateful that they're in this situation where there's so much social pressure coming from their devices, and yet they can't really break away. They can't not do it, right? So that's having some really caustic impact on people, right? So let's delay a little bit. Why rush? Why rush? Okay. So, and when it comes to preparing members of the next generation for post-Babel democracy, that's what he's calling this, perhaps the most important thing we can do is to let children out to play. Stop starving children of the experiences they most need to become good citizens. Free play and mixed age groups of children with minimal adult supervision. How many of our children ever got to experience that? I did as a kid, right? You step out into your neighborhood and you wait for the noon whistle for lunch and you wait for your dad's whistle to come home for dinner. The rest of your time was spent with your peers, mucking about and, probably mistreating each other a fair amount, but still learning how to kind of navigate the social environment, right? Free play and mixed age groups of children with minimal adult supervision. Every state should follow the lead of Utah, Oklahoma, and Texas and pass a version of the free range parenting law that helps assure parents that they will not be investigated for neglect if their 8 or 9-year-old children are spotted playing in a park. 8 or 9 years old. That's right, folks. New York was not on that list, you may notice. So if you're out there with your grandkids, make sure you're visible. But more importantly, let's think about a more reasonable way to look at what is out there for our children. You know, I know we're really worried about how children will be abused and everything else by people out in the world. Um, so we're letting them sit at their screens instead and getting abused by people on the internet. So, you know, got to choose your poisons. An interesting thing that's happening right now is that there are court cases that involve, I think, primarily Facebook right now, that are, or maybe it's Twitter, I don't quite remember. But it has to do with Texas has tried to impose, no, it's complained about the imposition of restrictions, I think, on Trump. I think that's what it was. And they're pushing back against that. And so there's this question about whether these internet carriers are actually common carriers as opposed to private industries per se. Right. So here's from Reuters. States that want to impose restrictions or controls on the content offered by social media sites and search engines have to confront a fundamental First Amendment obstacle. Internet companies are private businesses. So broadly speaking, they're entitled to constitutional protection from government interference with their free speech rights. But not if they fall into a special category of private businesses known as common carriers. Historically, common carriers were companies that sold public transportation services to all comers. In modern times, the definition expanded to include communications companies like telephone networks. So common carriers, again, speaking broadly, are subject to more regulation, including non-discrimination strictures than other companies, because they dominate the market for an essential public service. I mean, what was the duck rule for pornography? If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. I mean, come on, Facebook is not a common carrier. They're pushing back hard against it because they obviously don't want to be restricted. Well, that's probably where the action is going to be. But when you have this many billion people, how can it not be any less essential than a phone, for instance, right now? Okay, well, I'm happy to keep talking about it. Quite honestly, I'm finding this a very intriguing line of effort. I mean, the bottom line is it's really important for there to be some way to get to this system so that we can at least understand how it works, right? A lot of this code is hidden, right? That's one of the pieces in the chaos theory. The guy is saying, you know, one of the things you really need to do is insist that the government gets access to the algorithms so they can at least understand what's happening and how it's happening, right? But I think there's also, I think there certainly is an interest and a reasonable interest on the part of government to figure out how to have some level of interaction with these huge carriers. The U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals explained last week labeling social media platforms common carriers would allow states to evade or at least minimize First Amendment scrutiny. So the downside of this is doing it means the states get to control. And as we've seen, our states are pretty varied in terms of the quality of their control efforts, shall we say. So look, in the end, the first thing is to just remember the big problem here isn't really the platforms themselves, even though they're behaving hatefully and abusively by the way they've structured their systems, but they're taking advantage of the foibles of human nature. It's up to us, right? It's our foibles. We need to be figuring out how are we going to protect ourselves from being manipulated, and how can we help more people feel like they can navigate their experience in the social world reasonably, safely, and with some level of satisfaction and meaning. So I want to close with some words by Anna Lembke, Lembke. She wrote the book Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. And she writes, I urge you to find a way to immerse yourself fully in the life that you've been given. To stop running from whatever you're trying to escape, and instead to stop and turn and face whatever it is. Then I dare you to walk toward it. In this way, the world may reveal itself to you as something magical and awe-inspiring that does not require escape. Instead, the world may be becoming something worth paying attention to. The rewards of finding and maintaining balance are neither immediate nor permanent. They require patience and maintenance. We must be willing to move forward despite being uncertain of what lies ahead. We must have faith that actions today that seem to have no impact in the present moment are in fact accumulating in a positive direction, which will be revealed to us only at some unknown time in the future. So thank you, and I do hope that people will have a good experience of facing into the lives that they're living. Thanks. Jeff?